Is that better? Okay. So I'm going to read a passage from Some Luck, a passage from Early Warning, and a passage from Golden Age. The characters are all members of one family, the Langdon family, who start out in Iowa on a partially paid-for farm in 1920. The first child is Frank, and then he has 4 younger brothers and sisters. And so I will explain who my characters are, but just before I read each passage. But what I really like to do is answer questions. So I'll pause to answer a question anytime anybody raises a hand. So this passage is from Some Luck. And in this passage, which I believe is from 1935, Frank is now about 15. And, oh no, I'm sorry, it's from 1930. And Frank is 10, almost 11. And Eloise, whom he's about to talk to, is his aunt, who was born in 1907. So she's about 14 years older than Frank. The first time Frank heard the word communist was the day of Opa's funeral, when Eloise came home from Chicago. He heard Granny Mary tell Mama when they were standing in the kitchen with their backs to the door, "Eloise isn't a communist. It's that boyfriend." Frank went over to the plate of sandwiches and took another one. He was, of course, sorry that Opa had died, at least in a way. He, Joey, and Lillian had gotten to say goodbye to Opa only 4 days before. Mama kept them home from school and dressed them in iron shirts and pants. Then she and Papa had taken them in the car to Opa and Oma's house, where the bed was in the front room. Opa was lying there, covered up to the chin, even though the weather was pretty hot. Opa's head was tiny and his eyes were closed. Frank could just hear him breathing, but that was about it. Mama had led them to the bed one by one and had each of them take Opa's hand and say, "Goodbye, Opa. The Lord be with you. I love you." Then give him a kiss on the cheek. His cheek was wrinkled and dry like an autumn leaf. Mama said that he was alive, and Frank supposed it was so, but it was a faint sort of life Frank understood, and ready to be gone. Frank was an accomplished eavesdropper, though he would not have called it that. He would have just called it paying attention. And so he'd overheard all sorts of stories about Opa. Born in 1840, before there was even a state of Iowa, came to America on a tiny ship with no windows that he was allowed to see out of, met Oma just after the war between the states in Cleveland, Ohio, where apparently everyone spoke German, just like back in Germany. And then they came to Iowa. Granny Mary now said to Mama, "Well, Opa always said better a communist than an agriculturist." But he only said it in German. Communist was a different thing in those days. Frank's ears might have been 10 feet across, but he loitered innocently at the table. He had 2 ham sandwiches and an egg salad, which he liked very much. He reached for a Schnecken. In Iowa, to hear Opa tell it, he plowed his fields on his hands and knees with a spoon, although Oma always tapped him on the knee when he said this and exclaimed, "You had Tata and Maska, the 2 best Belgian draft horses in the country." "Yeah, well, they watched me and whinnied to me if I was doing a good job with my spoon." Then everyone would laugh. Opa started with 60 acres. That many. In Germany, no simple man like your Opa ever had 60 acres. They had 6 feet by 4 feet most of the time. Eventually, Opa ended up with 80 acres and was happy with that, he always said. Uncle Rolf had been farming them for him for 10 years now, Frank thought. He had them in hay some years and oats some years. Frank saw Granny Mary start to cry again and took his plate out of the room. Granny Mary said, "I was always so glad that he was my papa. I always was." And Mama said, "We all were." Mama put her arm around Granny Mary. Eloise was sitting on the sofa with Lillian on one side and Joey on the other. She was playing paper, stone, and scissors with him, and Lillian was laughing. They tapped their 3 fists on Eloise's knee and made their bets. Joey opened his fist, Eloise opened her fist, and Lillian spread her forefinger and middle finger, then pretended to cut the paper produced by the other 2. Frank set down his plate and said, "Can I play?" Eloise said, "Sure," and Joey scowled. Lillian's 4. Lillian said, "Frankie hits." "He does?" said Eloise. Joey said, "If he's the rock and you have scissors, Frankie says he can punch you in the arm." Eloise looked at him. "Is that true? It's not a hard punch." "Yes," said Lillian decidedly, "it is." Lillian was 4.5 now, but even though she was small, Frankie thought she talked like a 6-year-old or even a 7-year-old. He said, "I won't hit this time. I'll stop that rule for now." "Okay," said Eloise. They played 4 rounds. Frank won 1 round with paper, Joey won with rock, and Eloise 2. 1 with scissors and 1 with rock. Lillian yawned and leaned against Eloise, who put her arm around the little girl. Joey reached for Eloise's wrist and looked at her watch. He said, "It's 9:15 already." "Late," said Eloise. "So, go to bed," said Frank. He wanted to find out what a communist was. At the very thought of bed, Joey yawned. Frank said, "I'm not tired." "Are you ever?" said Eloise. Frank shrugged. Actually, the answer was no. Even when he went to bed at night, it was because he was told to, not because he was tired. Frank asked Eloise, "Do you miss Opa?" "Sure, everyone misses Opa. He was always nice. He's the only person I ever met who was always nice." "Why was that?" said Joey. "He said he left his naughty side in Germany," said Eloise, standing on the dock calling to him as the boat left the harbor, his evil twin. "For years I thought he really had a twin." "Did he?" said Joey, but Frank knew the answer. "No, it was just a way of talking." They were quiet for a long time after that, and just like a miracle, Joey yawned again and got up from the couch, while Lillian, who should have been in bed hours ago, closed her eyes and fell asleep. Frank said, "Eloise?" "What?" "What's a communist?" Eloise only smiled. "Are you a communist?" "Not quite. Did someone say I was?" "No." "Then why do you bring it up?" She shifted on the sofa and laid Lillian out flat, then took a shawl that Granny Elizabeth had made off the back of the sofa and laid it over her. "They said, your beau is a communist." Now Eloise laughed out loud. "Why are you laughing?" "At the idea of Julius Silber ever being called a beau. He would call himself my comrade." "What's that?" "A friend and fellow worker, someone who wants the same things I do. We don't use words like beau or fiancé. They're too French. Julius is English." "So, a communist is someone who doesn't like French things?" "Grandpa Wilmer is like that." Eloise pursed her lips and sat back, then said, "Well, Frankie, either you are putting me on or you're really interested. I can't ever tell with you." "I want to know, I do." She blew out some air and looked toward Granny Mary, then said, "Communists are people who see how unfair the world is and want to make it more fair. They see that some people have much, much more than they will ever need, and other people have nothing, and they don't think that there's any special reason for that, like God ordaining it or something." "Why do you think it is?" "Well, I think there are a lot of reasons, but the reasons are different here than they are in France or, say, England. Julius was born in England, so he has different ideas from mine." "How?" "Well, in England, things are really unfair and have been for centuries, and if a person tries to better himself, he really can't, because the system won't allow it. But in America, things that are unfair are more changeable because they've only been unfair for, say, 70 or 80 years, and also the country is so big that if things are unfair in, say, Virginia, you can go to Texas or California and try it there." "I would go to Chicago." Eloise, looking just like the image of Chicago that Frank always thought of in her smooth black dress and short hair that was waved and pressed against her head, patted him on the cheek and said, "I keep waiting for you." Are things unfair in Chicago? Well, Julius and I talk about that every day. Let's say that they are less unfair than they are in England, and Julius likes it because he can live there and do what he wants. But it's pretty wild. There are gangsters, you know, but if they repeal prohibition, I think things will calm down there. Are things unfair here? Nothing unfair here but the weather. However, the weather is pretty unfair lately. This Frank knew was true. He looked at Eloise for a moment, then said, "Can I kiss you goodnight?" "Sure." She offered her cheek, and he bent toward her, but her smell was so good that he ended up kissing her on the lips. She pushed him away and said, "Oh, Frankie, goodness, what is Rosanna going to do with you?" So that's Frank starting out. Okay, so this episode came from something that I learned, that I heard about. It's not something that happened to me, but I heard about it after I graduated from college. It happened to a friend of mine, and I loved it so much that I had to stick it in the book. So Frank grows up, and he gets married, and he has 3 children. The oldest is Janet, who's born in 1950, and then there are 2 twins, Michael and Richie, who are born in 1953. Now, Michael and Richie are hard to handle, and so they get sent to military school, a pretty strict military school. And so now it is, I think, 1970. Yeah, 1970. Richie figured they were looking for him by now. He had maybe one day, and so he was going to make the best of it by joining the Army. Once you were in the Army, they couldn't get you back. He was 17. He'd been to military school for years now. Whatever that thing was about parental consent, well, he would deal with that if they realized the letter he'd given him was a forgery. And he looked 18. Michael was still bigger than he was, but not much, 6'3", 170 versus 6'3 and a half, 175. If he caught Michael unawares, he could still knock him down, but he hadn't done that in a year. Now they mostly ignored each other. Michael liked the Kinks, Richie liked Black Sabbath. That was all a person needed to know. Anyway, he was in Boston, and here was that bus that was taking him to where he would go through the physical and the tests, wherever they were, whatever they were. He was the first to get on, and he walked to the back and sat down. It was a nice July day, sunny but damp, a Boston day, not like that armpit in the Midwest where they sweated all day and night. It was a week since he'd walked out of the job his dad got him, painting at a country club, though it didn't look very exclusive to Richie. They painted green some days, and they painted white other days, and the painters talked about whorehouses and tattoos. Now Richie stared out the window at guys in uniforms, telling the recruits to move it, get going. Finally, the sergeant followed the last guy onto the bus, and the door started to close. One of the draftees jumped out of his seat and said, "We need to vote on that." The sergeant said, "Sit down." The kid didn't sit down. In fact, Richie saw the kid was older than the sergeant. He said, "America is still a democracy. This bus will move when the people have decided it will move. Men!" He turned toward the guys in the seats. "Everyone who wants the door to close, say aye." Richie shouted, "Aye." There were maybe 5 or 6 ayes. "No! No!" The whole bus erupted. The kid said, "I think we need to debate this. Parliamentary procedures apply." The sergeant said, "Sit down." The kid went right up to him and put his arm around the sergeant's waist and pushed into him slightly. He maybe outweighed the sergeant by 20 pounds. He said in a calm voice, "Let's have a debate, all right?" He kept his arm around the sergeant, kept pushing into him until the sergeant backed toward the driver and shrugged. The debate was about closing the door and then about driving away, lasted 20 minutes. Richie participated. He made the case against blocking traffic. When the sergeant sat down, the kid sat down right beside him. It was clear who was the boss. When the bus pulled up at the facility, the door opened and an older man got on, also a sergeant, but a lifer. The bus went dead quiet. The sergeant handed out cards and pencils. They had to write down their names, birth dates, and some other information. When everyone just sat there, the sergeant pretended to get mad and said, "Move it!" The kids stood up. "Sit down," shouted the sergeant. The kids said, "It is moved by the sergeant here that I sit down. Second the motion." A hand went up. "What the? All in favor?" A few eyes, not Richie. Richie wanted to see what might happen. "All opposed," the bus roared. The sergeant shouted, "Son, if you don't sit down, I'll sit you down." The kids said, "Motion made to sit me down by force. Second?" A hand went up. "All in favor." As everyone in the bus shouted, "Aye," the sergeant pushed the kid into his seat. But he popped up to exclaim, "Motion carried." Everyone laughed. Now they scribbled, but when the sergeant told them to pass their pencils forward, they all threw their pencils right at him. He had to duck. By the time they had debated and voted for getting off the bus, even he looked a little intimidated, though red-faced and angry. Richie didn't know what to think. Once inside the building, they were told to line up. Richie suspected that he was between two guys who knew each other, though they didn't look at or talk to each other. For a while, things went along, no debates or votes. The chairman of the bus was 5 guys ahead of Richie, and the only thing he did was try to engage every doctor or orderly he met in conversation. Was Dr. So-and-so aware that 68% of American voters no longer favored the war in Vietnam? How did Dr. This and That personally feel about the invasion of Cambodia? Had Dr. Up and Down known Lieutenant Calley personally, and was he present for the My Lai massacre? This last was said in a smooth and friendly voice. "Keep it moving," was all the Army people said, but it moved very slowly because it seemed like it took everyone in the line at least a minute to unlace each shoe and unbutton each button. Richie thought that the Army personnel were pretty patient. They came to a large room and were told to strip down to their underwear, put their clothes into a basket, and stay in line. It was then that he saw that the kid in front of him had painted black skulls with red eyes on his chest and his back, with the words U.S. Army across his collarbones. The kid behind him had a bomb blast on his back. The line moved, and the doctors kept their eyes down. The chairman, still 5 ahead, had a map of Cambodia on his back and the words, "Next stop, Peking." They shuffled along very slowly. At one point, the front group paused, and Richie could see the first guy come to a doctor sitting on a stool. He turned his head to the right and coughed, then to the left and coughed. He stood there. A few minutes later, when Richie got a better view, he saw that each kid was dropping his pants, and the doctor was sticking his finger up into the kid's scrotum. They shuffled forward. Finally, the chairman came to the doctor sitting on the stool. The doctor's assistant muttered something, and the chairman said, "Please repeat your request. Take your pants down." "Pardon? Je ne comprends pas." The doctor and his assistant exchanged a glance, and then the doctor said, "Baissez votre slip, tout de suite." And the kid dropped his pants. Everyone crowded close to have a look. Painted on his chest was an arrow pointing downward, and affixed to the tip of his cock was a photograph cut from a magazine of President Nixon. Everyone laughed, and even the doctor cracked a tiny smile. Richie had been told. It really happened, but only in Boston. Richie had been told that processing would take a couple of hours, but it was mid-afternoon by the time they were back on the bus, so it had taken 6 hours and 15 minutes. He was tired, and he was glad that the yippies, because that's what they were, had let the bus go back into town. It dropped them at the recruiting office. Richie didn't quite know what to do next. He had thought somehow that the back door of the facility would open onto a platform, and all the ones who'd passed their physicals would get on a train or a bus to Fort Dix. From there, he would call home and tell them what he had done. But now he was in Boston, not far from Kenmore Square, with some change in his pocket, and he was 17 years old, and he didn't know what to do. Thanks. So time passes, and amazingly enough, to everyone who knows Richie, including you and I, he gets elected to Congress. He's a very sweet boy, though. And so this takes place in 1992. And there's and Richie's elected to Congress from Brooklyn. So imagine this scene, which isn't very long. It takes place in Brooklyn. Richie had the lease on his little campaign office on 6th Avenue near 9th Street until the end of the year, which gave him plenty of time to get it cleaned up. The best thing about it, it was only 14 feet wide and 30 feet deep, and so it had been cheap, was that it was across the street from Colson's, where he always went for coffee. It was there that Charlie and the girlfriend ambushed him at 9 a.m. the day after the election. Charlie is a younger relative. They let him get his coffee and pay for it, along with a rugelach and an apricot tart. And so his hands were full, and his cup was hot, and he could not get away. And they stood between him and the door, too. Richie was tired of the campaign and ready for a break, but he said, "Okay, let's sit down." When Charlie pulled out the seat they'd been keeping for him, Richie wondered if they'd followed him from Park Slope. Richie had won 53.4% to 46.1%, leaving out the handful who'd voted for the Socialists and the 3 voters who voted for the Conservative Party. It was a margin that would have deeply shamed Congressman Schur. Richie himself didn't know if this was a good omen or a bad one, a sign of the times, or something personal. He told himself that he was in all that mattered. Riley was talking, Charlie was smiling, Richie was putting on his paying attention face. Riley said, "Sir, as far as I am concerned and the people I work with, this is the most important issue of our age. I'm not kidding." "She's not kidding," said Charlie. Richie said, "Explain it to me again in a way that I can understand." She was good. She did not take a single impatient breath. She did not even fleetingly get a "you idiot" look on her face. She did what he would have done with an angry Perot supporter. She smiled and said, "Okay, Clinton was elected just barely, and now it is really our only chance. I mean, let's put it this way." Charlie interrupted. "Pornographers have control of the White House now, and militant homosexuals run the armed forces." Richie actually glanced around to see if anyone was looking at them. His sister-in-law, Loretta, had said almost that very thing a week or so ago, except, of course, she wasn't joking. "And," said Riley, "we can close the ozone hole, because that was an atheist plot, and now we've won." She had a big smile. That was her pretty part. She got serious immediately and leaned toward him. "But the greenhouse effect is harder to deal with. We atheists and our trained SEAL scientists cannot do it alone, and God doesn't seem to care, so I want a job." "What would your job be?" said Richie. "Congressmen have staff," said Charlie, "people who get on TV and say, 'The congressman has no comment at this time.'" "I do need someone like that. What's your name? Riley? Let's hear you." Riley cleared her throat, then said, "The congressman has no comment at this time about whether 6 prostitutes did indeed jump from the 3rd-story windows of the West Wing, but he would like to point out that all of the prostitutes signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change while they were visiting with the president and are completely in agreement with the aims of the protocol, namely to commit themselves to a reduction of carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur, hexafluoride, and their own personal favorite, nitrous oxide, or laughing gas." Her smile was perfectly flat and fake, just the way the networks liked it. She went on. "And of course, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons. We understand that before the jump, 3 of the prostitutes were preparing a statement to this effect. We greatly regret what appears to be a heartbreaking tragedy, and we would like to remind the audience that everyone must pull together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by our agreed-upon 5.2%. Thank you, And once again, the congressman regrets being called away on pressing business just now. I have no further comment. Her smile broadened. Richie said, perfect. Charlie said, I've been coaching her. Riley said, I can also answer hate mail, death threats, and accusations that you bear the mark of the devil on your forehead, which is why you always wear a baseball cap. Do you have practice answering those sorts of letters? We don't answer them, but I think they should be answered. Charlie offered helpfully. She still has to write her dissertation, but she's finished with her coursework. What is the subject of your dissertation? Methods of motivating governing elites to understand and address climate issues. So, I'm your experimental subject. You're the only one either of us has met. Charlie said, we drove through Iowa during the drought 4 years ago, but I was too shy to stop and see Joe or even Minnie. I really liked Minnie. Riley turned glum, then said, I'm so sorry I missed that, but I did 2 papers on the Yellowstone fires. How old are you? Said Richie. 26, said Riley. Do you want to be part of an experiment? Sure, said Riley. Okay, my sister-in-law will be one of those people writing you hate mail. You should meet her and try out your techniques on her. Michael's wife, said Charlie. Richie nodded. Charlie said, I got that vibe off her. My dad has 20,000 head of cattle, and we eat ribs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and you would remove them from my cold, dead hands sort of vibe. Richie looked at the clock behind the baked goods display. It was almost 11, and he had done nothing as yet this morning. Ivy was not sanguine about the presidential election. She thought the victory was enough to shrink the population of right-wing bacteria, but not enough to kill them all, so the stronger ones would reproduce and return more virulent than ever, though she did think that eventually she would win over Michael, who was basically well-meaning, and Loretta, who had to be more sharply defined than Michael just to maintain his interest and respect. Richie said, what are you doing this morning, Riley? Following you around. Richie said, I will pay you each $1 over the minimum wage, which is $4.25 per hour, to help me clean up my campaign headquarters starting right now. 1 hour every day for lunch, no benefits until I get to Washington, but you can come to dinner Friday night and meet Ivy and Leo. $5.50, said Charlie. Richie pulled some change out of his pocket and threw it on the table, then said, you got it. So that's somebody emailed me and said she'd counted 100 characters. And I haven't counted the characters, but let's say she's right. So that's a few of the 100 characters. So some questions. Any questions? Yeah. Okay. But I think you get the general gist. Sure. What do I have a similar process for writing fiction and nonfiction? Well, the nonfiction books have been quite different from one another, and so I would say, you know, for the book about the invention of the computer, there was a lot of research, and every single story of every single person who was trying to invent the computer was totally unbelievable. So the research was fascinating because there were so many odd events. The research for 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel was just reading books. What could be more fun, you know? And writing it was fun because the books would produce my reaction to them. The research for A Year at the Races was going to the racetrack all the time. Oh, how could I do it? But you know, doing the fiction books has been also diverse. But I think the difference for me has been that the fiction each book in the fiction books seems to have a kind of inner completeness that it's my job to find. And sometimes it's harder to find than other times, but I have this sense that there's a hole in there, and I just have to work and work and work to kind of put it together. The nonfiction books have not given me that feeling. You know, when I have to cut something from the fiction books, I go back and forth. I think, can I really cut this? Do I have to cut this? The nonfiction books I would read through, and I'd say, oh, that's bullshit, and throw it out. So, you know, I think they're coming from different parts of my brain, the two types. But anything that demands research is fine with me. Oh, yeah, there's a microphone in the middle. So don't hesitate. Nobody else has a question? Yeah.
I have a question on the trilogy. Do you think that this is a political trilogy?
Absolutely, because all novels are political. Because all novels are about how the protagonist and the group that the protagonist is part of, how they come together. And either somebody wins, the protagonist or the group, somebody loses, or they kind of have a truce. And there has to be the group, there has to be the world that the protagonist lives in, because a novel is too long for it to be just a small thing. So inevitably, it's going to be political. Now, some authors acknowledge the political, some authors don't acknowledge the political. But for me, if I'm going to write a book about the last 100 years, I have to acknowledge the political. And I try to make it reasonably diverse. But I have to acknowledge the political. Yeah?
How do you determine what issues are germane of the time that you're writing in? How do you sort of cherry pick them and figure out what...
Well, I stick my characters into the world that they're in, and then I think about the issues from their point of view and which ones would have been important to them. So in Richie's generation, Richie is ready to go off to Vietnam, but his sister Janet is extremely against the war in Vietnam and goes to quite a famous protest against the war in Vietnam. And so since it's a large family, and once they're out of Iowa, they kind of spread out into the world. I would pay attention to who they were, who we hadn't seen for a while, what might be a believable issue for that person to take up. And then I would go through. But they weren't involved in everything, so they had to be only involved in some things. And as soon as I stuck them on the farm and started talking about the production of food and farm life and those issues, then there I was with climate and environment. So those probably emerge as the most important issues in this trilogy. Anybody else? Yeah.
How did you get your great sense of how Iowa farm families stay in the field? I grew up an Iowa farm, and you really was nailed.
Thank you. She asked how did I get my sense of Iowa, how Iowans are. You know, I lived there for 24 years, and I'm a terrific eavesdropper. And I also used to read the farm section of the Des Moines Register all the time. And quite a lot of times in the farm section, there would be interviews with farmers. So I would hear them talk, I'd read about them talking, I would listen to what people had to say about where they grew up. I would drive around and look at the towns that they lived in, looked at the farms that they lived on. And then for specifics, there are two websites, two model farm websites. One's an Iowa one and one's a Nebraska one. And I went there, and at least one of them, I think, but maybe both of them, have recordings of farmers talking about their lives and what life on the farm was like. And I listened to a lot of those, and they were really informative. And yeah.
Could I just make one little comment? I grew up, you mentioned the POW camp in Algona, Iowa in the year 1944, and that's where I grew up, and those POWs would come and work for my father
Oh, really?
and get cigarettes ready by tying him for the war effort.
Oh, really? So if I'd known you, I would have called you up.
And they made a nativity scene in their spare time that's still on exhibit in that town.
That's really interesting. And thank you for telling me that. Somebody on this side, those people can't ask all the questions. Yes, right here.
So for such a sprawling work, I mean, did your characters ever get away from you? I mean, did they take you in directions that you weren't expecting?
Oh, absolutely. I didn't know ahead of time what I knew in general. I knew how old they were. I knew that they were going to have certain characteristics. They would be born with certain characteristics. I knew that some were going to get out of town and some were going to stick around town. And I knew the general history, but I didn't know it in detail. So lots of times they would go to places and do things that I had no idea about. For example, after the war, Joe, who's the one who takes over the farm, he goes to the seed store, and there's a guy there who wants to sell them nitrous fertilizer. And when I was researching about the development of fertilizer from war chemicals, there was a story about an incredibly large explosion of a ship in Galveston Harbor that was carrying nitrous to France. And it started to leak, and then it exploded. I mean, planes fell out of the air. It was such a big explosion. And I had never heard about that, but it was obvious that Joe would hear about that. So that's the sort of thing that came as a surprise to me, and so I stuck it in. Yes?
This is one of those moments where I've always wanted to ask you this question.
Okay.
I'm embarrassed to ask you. But A Thousand Acres is one of my favorite books.
Uh-huh.
And the depth of wisdom and understanding about human nature has always struck me. I'm a therapist for 35 years.
Oh, thank you.
How did this woman know so much about the impact of secrets in a family and the nature of the internal lives so accurately and beautifully brought? Is that a gift, or is that honed and cultivated over a lifetime?
Well, I would say both, but part of it is, that I grew up in a really gossipy family. And no, I'm not kidding. People always laugh at that. But when you grow up in a gossipy family, first of all, you pick up the words, you pick up how they talk and how that's different. Say how Aunt Jane talks is different from how your mom talks or Aunt Nancy talks or Grandma talks. And they always had a theory because they were always telling stories. And they didn't disagree. They didn't agree about the stories. Each one of them always had their own theory. So that got me interested in theories of behavior, theories of causation, theories of what happened. And then I loved reading. I loved reading novels. And one of my favorite things that I learned about Dickens was that that Freud conceived of his theory of development after reading David Copperfield. And I thought, well, why not? Novels are all about cause and effect. And they're all about the inner life and the outer life and how they mesh. And so there are those aspects. But then I'd spent years having to read King Lear and not really liking it. And because I always thought that Goneril and Reagan didn't get to say their piece, that we didn't get to know what their side of the story was. And so for years I wanted to talk about what their side of the story might be. Now, I'm not saying that it was easy to write that book, because, and after it was done, I thought, my uncle, Bill Shakespeare, he had a hard time writing this play, too. He picked it up, he looked at it, he thought, this could be good. He was 20 years old or something like that. And I know he was leafing through, and I said, I don't know what I'm going to do here. But so I had that sense that we did the best we could. He did the best he could from his side, and I did the best I could from my side. But obviously, his insights fed into me, and then my insights were based on his. So, yeah.
Do you ever so fall in love with your characters that it breaks your heart to end the book?
No. Especially if it's really long. My desire to keep going sometimes goes on past the book, and sometimes it doesn't go on until the book is done. Sometimes I want to quit before it's done, simply because I'm sort of exhausted by these particular characters. In this case, I would have to say it exactly coincided. I finished the final changes in the page proofs, and I was done. And I was, they left me, and I left them, and it was, agreeable rift. Yeah.
Do you already have in your mind what you're going to do for your next project?
No. Well, I don't ever say. No. Yes.
I always like to know writers, where they like to write, when they like to write, and I was wondering if there's a certain place you go to when you start to sit down and actually.
Well, I have an office in my house, and it's right off the kitchen. And then it also has a room into the bedroom. And actually, the New York Times did a piece called Writers' Rooms. I think it was in like September. And you can see pictures of it in there. It's junky. It was the messiest one of all the writers' rooms. And it's full of dogs and dog toys. And I don't mind being interrupted. So it's a very interruptible space. But I'm pretty flexible about when, because I ride horses, and my trainer has kids, and so that's the first question of the day, or when am I going to ride, and then when am I going to write? So that's how I do it. I like writing, so I don't have to make any discipline or anything. I just do it. And you'll see that I do have a secret in the writer's room, but you have to look at the article to see what it is. Oh, yes, the one over here. Can't see you very well.
Did you want to write a trilogy and thought this story would lend itself to the trilogy, or did you want to tell the story and decide that the best way to tell it was with the trilogy?
I wanted to write this book called The Last 100 Years, and I wanted it to go year by year, and I wanted it each year to be reasonably substantial. And so I knew that was going to be so long that it had to be a trilogy. It could have been 4 books, it could have been 5 books, could have been 10 books. But a trilogy was kind of the most obvious way to do it. I didn't want it to be too big to pick up, and I didn't want it to have print so small that you couldn't read it. Well, thank you very much for coming. And thank you for the good questions.
Thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight. Ms. Smiley is going to be signing here on the left side. We have other events going on campus today. If you want to go down 2nd Avenue to the Swamp and the Porch, we have an interdisciplinary poetry film event starting in about 10 minutes, and then we have Oriente, an Afro-Cuban jazz band that's really quite wonderful at 8 p.m., and there's food, and there's a bar, and we welcome you all to stay. Thank you.
Have you ever read that book? I mean, isn't that, I